I drove up to my mountain cabin expecting an empty house, a quiet afternoon with the realtor, and maybe enough time afterward to sit on the porch with a cup of coffee before heading back to Charlotte. Instead, I opened the front door and heard laughter. Not television laughter. Real laughter. Loud, comfortable, familiar laughter. Then came the sound of wine glasses clinking. I stepped into the living room and stopped cold. Sarah's parents were sprawled across my furniture like they owned the place. Brenda sat barefoot on my cream-colored sofa with a wine glass in her hand. Larry was digging through a pizza box at my heirloom cherry coffee table, the one my father built in 1972. 3 other relatives I'd never even met were camped around the fireplace. My bottle of Cabernet sat open on the counter. Grease stains covered my table runner. And Brenda looked up at me and laughed. "Diane, what are you doing here?" I stood there holding my spare key so tightly it hurt my hand. Sarah, my daughter-in-law, had given them access to my cabin without asking me. Brenda waved her glass casually. Sarah said we could stay a few weeks. The place was just sitting empty anyway. Then she smiled wider. "Honestly, this house is basically going to be Sarah and Jason's someday. We're just getting a head start enjoying the inheritance." That sentence told me everything I needed to know. Not just about Brenda. About all of them. About how long they'd been treating my generosity like ownership. I didn't yell. At 68 years old, I've learned something important. The loudest person in the room usually has the least control. So I walked past her into the kitchen and looked around quietly. Dirty dishes stacked in the sink. Crumbs everywhere. Someone had spilled sauce on my counters. Brenda followed behind me sipping wine. "Don't get your feathers ruffled," she said. "We're family." Family. Funny word. People use it most when they want access to something that belongs to you. I turned around, walked out of the cabin, got into my car, and drove back to Charlotte without another word. Brenda yelled after me asking if I could at least take the trash out on my way. They thought I was retreating. They thought quiet Diane was going home to cry. What they didn't realize was that I was already mentally reviewing every financial account, utility bill, and property authorization connected to that cabin. By the time I reached Charlotte, I had stopped feeling angry. I felt clear. There's a difference. My townhouse was exactly how I'd left it. Quiet. Ordered. Mine. I made tea, sat down at my desk, and opened my laptop. First thing I did was log into the savings account I'd created for Jason and the grandkids years earlier. $60,000. Money intended for a future house down payment. Jason had access to the account, but legally the money was still mine. I transferred every dollar back into my private account. Not out of spite. Out of correction. Generosity without boundaries becomes entitlement. I'd finally learned that. Next, I canceled the cleaning service for the cabin. Then the utility autopay. Electricity. Water. Gas. If Brenda and her relatives wanted a vacation house, they could finance it themselves. The next morning, Sarah stormed into my townhouse without knocking. "Diane, what the hell was that yesterday?" I kept watering my African violets. "What exactly are you referring to?" "My parents are devastated." "You walked out without saying a word." I finally looked at her. "They were drinking my wine in my house after moving themselves into my cabin without permission." "Yes, Sarah. They were unwelcome." She scoffed like I was being unreasonable. "We're family." "No," I said calmly. "You are family. Your parents are guests. Guests ask permission." Her expression hardened. "Jason said it was fine." I folded my hands carefully. "Jason does not own my property." Then came the sentence that snapped the final thread. "Why are you making such a huge deal out of this? That cabin is going to be ours eventually anyway." "Eventually." I looked directly at her. "Later isn't now." She crossed her arms. Jason also noticed the savings account is empty. There it was. Not concern about boundaries. Not concern about disrespect. Money. I motioned toward the kitchen chair. She refused to sit. "That account was a gift," I said quietly. "And gifts can be revoked when people start treating the giver like an inconvenience." Her jaw tightened. "You seriously pulled our down payment because my parents stayed at your cabin?" "No," I corrected. "I pulled it because you decided my property belonged to you before I was even dead." For the first time since I'd known her, Sarah didn't have a comeback ready. She slammed the door on the way out. A few hours later, Jason arrived. My son looked exhausted before he even sat down. "Mom," he sighed. "Does it really have to be like this?" I pushed a plate of cookies toward him like I used to when he was 14. "Did you give them the key?" His silence answered for him. "Sarah said it would be temporary," he muttered. "And did temporary include drinking my wine and treating the place like a motel?" Jason rubbed his forehead. "They just needed somewhere to stay." I nodded slowly. "I already hired a realtor. Walkthrough for long-term renters is next week. Your in-laws need to leave by Sunday night." His head snapped up. "They can't. Brenda unpacked everything already." I smiled faintly. "Then they'll be unpacking it in the dark. Utilities shut off Monday morning." He stared at me like I was a stranger. "You wouldn't actually do that." "I absolutely would." For years Jason had only known one version of me. Patient Diane. Helpful Diane. Quiet Diane. He'd never met the version that stopped negotiating with disrespect. Sunday evening I drove back to the mountains with a locksmith waiting near the gravel driveway. The cabin lights glowed warmly through the windows. Music drifted outside. They still thought I was bluffing. Brenda opened the door wearing my bathrobe and holding another glass of wine. "Diane," she laughed. "Back again." I stepped inside with the locksmith behind me. "What is this?" she snapped. I nodded toward the locksmith. "Mr. Miller is here to change the locks." Everything exploded after that. Larry came stumbling into the hallway asking what was going on. One cousin started filming with her phone. Brenda shrieked loud enough to shake the windows. "You can't throw us out on a Sunday night." I checked my watch calmly. "It's 8 o'clock. You have 30 minutes. The locksmith began removing the deadbolt while Brenda called Sarah screaming into the phone. But something strange happened while they panicked. I felt peaceful. Not cruel. Not vindictive. Just done. People lose power over you the moment you stop needing their approval. Within 30 minutes, plastic bags, suitcases, and half-packed boxes covered the driveway. Brenda cried. Larry cursed. One cousin muttered that I was evil. I locked the new deadbolt while they stood outside in the cold mountain air staring at me like I'd betrayed them. But I hadn't betrayed anyone. I had simply stopped volunteering to be used. Monday morning the realtor toured the cabin. The place smelled like old pizza and cheap perfume, but structurally it was fine. I hired a deep cleaning crew and installed a second lock on the wine cellar. When I got back to Charlotte, Jason was waiting outside my townhouse. "Brenda and Larry had to get a motel," he said immediately. "Sarah is furious." I unlocked my front door. "I'm sure she is. We don't have money for this, Mom." I turned toward him slowly. "And yet somehow your wife believed she could casually inherit my property before I was even buried." Jason looked away. That told me more than any argument could. Inside, I handed him a document I drafted that morning. "If you want the house down payment restored," I said calmly, "these are my conditions." He scanned the paper. The mountain cabin would now be professionally managed as a rental property. No family member would receive a key. The savings account for the grandkids would remain under my sole control. And Sarah would provide a written apology acknowledging what she'd done. Jason stared at the page for a very long time. "Mom, Sarah will never agree to this." I took a sip of tea. "Then I suppose you'll need to find another down payment." For 2 weeks there was silence. Then came the manipulation stage. Photos of the grandkids. Messages about how much they missed Nana. Comments about family misunderstanding. I answered politely but briefly. I wasn't angry anymore, which actually made me harder to move. Then the purchase contract on their dream house expired. Jason called sounding hollow. "We lost the house." I closed my eyes for a second. Part of me hurt for him. But another part understood this was the first real consequence he'd ever experienced for letting Sarah control everything. "Pride is expensive," I said quietly. Things unraveled fast after that. Brenda and Larry ran out of motel money and moved into Jason and Sarah's apartment. Suddenly Sarah's perfect little life wasn't so perfect anymore. 5 adults in a 2-bedroom apartment will expose every crack in a marriage. One afternoon Brenda actually called me personally. She tried guilt first, then flattery, then insults. I hung up halfway through the conversation and blocked her number permanently. I started spending more time with friends, visiting museums, gardening, taking myself to lunch. It amazed me how much energy I'd wasted for years managing other people's emotions. Then one evening Jason arrived carrying a suitcase. "I can't do this anymore, Mom." He looked exhausted. Apparently the apartment had become non-stop chaos. Fighting about money, fighting about space, fighting about who was responsible. I stepped aside and let him in. "You can stay in the guest room," I told him. "But we are not discussing money or negotiating about Sarah." For 3 days Jason stayed quietly in my townhouse. Something shifted during that time. He saw how peaceful my life was. How organized. How calm. No screaming. No pressure. No manipulation. Just boundaries. On the 4th morning Sarah knocked on my door. Actually knocked. That alone told me things had changed. When I opened it, she looked exhausted. Hair messy. Eyes swollen. "Is Jason here?" "He's asleep." She nodded awkwardly. "My parents left. They're staying with my brother now." I waited silently. Silence is powerful. Most people rush to fill it. Finally she whispered, "I'm sorry." The words sounded painful coming out of her mouth. "I'm sorry about the cabin. And my mother. I shouldn't have let it happen." I studied her carefully. For once there was no performance in her face. Just exhaustion. "That's a start," I said. "But apologies without changed behavior are just noise." I let her inside. The 3 of us sat at the kitchen table where I'd spent years quietly absorbing disrespect, because I thought keeping peace mattered more than maintaining dignity. Not anymore. I laid out new terms calmly. The savings account would remain for the grandchildren, but under my control. If I helped them buy a house, the deed would remain in my name for 5 years. No more access to my property without permission. No more treating my generosity like an obligation. Sarah opened her mouth to argue automatically, then looked at Jason. For the first time he didn't rescue her. He looked tired. And honest. "Mom's right," he said quietly. "We blew it." That moment mattered more than the apology, because Jason had finally stopped confusing love with surrender. The months afterward were uncomfortable at first. Boundaries usually are. But slowly things stabilized. The cabin was rented to a lovely couple from Atlanta who sent me photos of the garden and treated the property better than some relatives treat family. The rental income secured my retirement beautifully. Jason enrolled in a certification course Sarah used to mock as unnecessary. I paid the tuition directly to the school. Not because I didn't trust him, because structure protects relationships better than resentment does. Eventually we had family dinners again. Quiet ones. Civilized ones. No Brenda. No Larry. Sarah accepted that without complaint. One afternoon she stopped by alone carrying flowers. Not expensive flowers. Thoughtful ones. "I wanted to thank you," she said quietly, "for helping Jason when things got bad." I took the flowers from her carefully. "I love my son," I said. "But I also love myself now. That's the difference." She looked at me thoughtfully. "How did you stay so calm through all of this?" she asked. "When all of us were basically attacking you?" I smiled faintly. I wasn't calm because I didn't care. I was calm because I finally understood something. She waited. When you know exactly what belongs to you, and exactly what you're worth, you stop needing emotional chaos to defend either one. That stayed with her. I could see it. Today I'm sitting on my patio overlooking my garden while sunlight hits the brick path I spent years planting myself. My phone sits beside me, but it no longer controls my mood. The mountain cabin is cared for. Jason and Sarah are rebuilding their marriage slowly and carefully. And me? I finally learned that boundaries aren't cruelty. They're maintenance. People think strength always looks loud. Sometimes strength is just a 69-year-old woman quietly changing the locks on a Sunday night and refusing to apologize for it afterward. I still drive up to the cabin sometimes when the tenants are away. I sit on the porch with a glass of wine and listen to the wind through the trees. The old cherrywood furniture is exactly where it belongs. The house smells like pine again instead of stale pizza. And every time I lock the front door before leaving, I slide the key into my pocket and smile a little. Because I'm Diane. And after all these years I finally stopped giving my keys away.